Hola, amigas, and welcome to the Gold Hoops and God podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Guerra. This podcast is designed for Millennial Latinas and is fueled by faith and culture. Ignite the fire within. Welcome back, mujeres. Welcome to episode 2 of the Gold Hoops and God podcast. How's everyone doing? If it's your first time tuning in, thank you for joining this community. I am super excited because I got a lot of great feedback on the first episode. If you have not checked it out, please go check it out. It's called Tower Moments and the Myth of the Late Bloomer. I think you'll like it. So this episode 2, is called Say It With Your Chest, Creating Healthy Boundaries. So in this episode, we're going to talk about boundaries and how to implement them. So let's get started. So in my first episode, I talked about tower moments and kind of these moments that really change our lives, that we gain a new perspective. And these tower moments at first can feel pretty painful, but oftentimes in hindsight, they actually offer a lot of clarity and they can really revolutionize the way that we move forward in life. So I want to focus on boundaries. I know there's been a lot of talk in social media, in, modern psychology about the importance of boundaries. So what are they and why are they so important? And as we get started, I want you to think about your own life and reflect on how boundaries are functioning in your life, or perhaps how implementing additional boundaries or more healthy boundaries could be beneficial. So, author Brene Brown, she has become very popular in terms of her work on vulnerability and really owning one's self and one's journey. So, she defines boundaries as making clear what's okay and what's not okay. So, that's a pretty good working definition. Boundaries can be understood as the limits that we set for ourselves within relationships. And a critical part of this is learning to say no, learning to say no to things that are not okay. And that can be very challenging, especially when it comes to saying no to parents or to partners or to children or to bosses. This is not easy. This is not easy work. However, it's so important. And a key piece of boundaries is also respecting other people's boundaries too. It's not just one way. The boundaries don't just go one way, right? We have our boundaries and other people have their boundaries too. And so it's important to respect those. And footnote, usually when we say no to things that we don't want, or we start to make clear what our boundaries and limits are, it actually makes room for positive things to come in. It makes room for the things that we do want. So I often think about that phrase, rejection is redirection. And I can absolutely attest to that in my own life. So I'll share with folks, since I am an academic, applying to grad school was a very stressful process. It was a really big deal. And I remember when was finishing up the master's program and I was getting ready to apply for the PhD program, I will admit I did not get admitted. I was rejected the first time around. And at the moment, I was absolutely horrified. I was heartbroken. It was the worst thing that had ever happened. Now looking back, it was actually a tremendous blessing, because what ended up happening is, after that rejection, I decided to go abroad. I went and did my master's in Spanish literature. And then I ended up teaching in San Francisco and teaching in an all-girls high school in San Francisco. And those 2 chapters, we'll call them, of my life were so foundational and really transformed me in a really amazing ways. I loved being abroad. I love experiencing a new country, a new way of being. It was really wonderful. If you know me in real life, you know how much I love Spain. And then being in San Francisco was also a lot of fun. Being in the classroom was very beneficial because it prepared me for being a professor now. And so again, God has God's plans. And when I applied again to the PhD program, I did get in and I was way, way, way better prepared. Looking back at the person I was when I first applied, she wouldn't have survived. Poor thing. I look back, I'm like, oh, poor little baby. She would not have survived because it's very intense. It's very intense. And so, again, I share this to say sometimes the things that don't work out are actually for our highest good. Okay, so back to boundaries. Let's dive in. So, according to Therapist Aid, there are actually 6 different types of boundaries. And I want to walk us through some of them. We'll kind of stop and chat at each one as we go. Okay, so the 6 boundaries are the following: there are physical boundaries, and those have to do more with personal space and physical touch. There are intellectual boundaries, which refer to thoughts and ideas. So it really includes respecting other people's opinions, other people's ideas. Emotional boundaries, that refers to people's feelings. So having good emotional boundaries is being able to hear people out and to not immediately jump in and criticize them or belittle them, that kind of thing. Sexual boundaries. Now, this is a big one as far as consent goes. Sexual boundaries really refer to the different aspects of sexuality, not just the physical aspects, but also the emotional, intellectual, and physical. And then we have material boundaries. So that has to do with people's possessions. People have items that are very special to them, that are very, I would even call them sacred to them. And so when that's disrespected, it can be very painful and very hard for someone to deal with. And then finally, the 6th type of boundary is a time boundary. So this has to do with how one uses their time and whether or not that's being respected. So let's get into it. So physical boundaries are pretty straightforward. And I really think about children in terms of physical boundaries. Often, you know, perhaps without really thinking about it, parents will often force their children to be physically affectionate with adults that maybe they don't feel comfortable with. So imagine a scenario of, oh, it's a birthday party, you know, Tio Manuel is here, cousin Maria is here, and perhaps the child feels uncomfortable, with that squeezing, come sit on my lap, that kind of thing. And so it's important to be conscious of what the child desires. The children are often not given space or not treated as autonomous beings. And so when it comes to physical boundaries, that's kind of what I think of when I think about that. And also, in terms of adults, not everyone's big into hugging. Not everyone's big into physical affection or, you know, sitting right next to someone, if there's a choice of seating, sometimes people don't want to sit right up next to someone. And I understand that, right? And so I think it's important to be aware of these things. I ask people, especially if they're new in my life or I don't know them very well, I always ask, can I give you a hug? Because I'm a hugger. I like to give hugs. I'm an affectionate person. And so I don't want to make somebody else uncomfortable, and kind of push them away by like grabbing them. It can be very uncomfortable. So those are just some examples. Another boundary that we mentioned are intellectual boundaries. And so this one has to do with thoughts and ideas. And it's true. I believe this can be rather challenging or kind of interesting when it comes to families, right? In a family, picture like Thanksgiving dinner, people who have different opinions about politics or religion or that kind of thing, being able to navigate those scenarios in a respectful way. It's not always easy. It's not always easy. So developing healthy boundaries, being able to respect other people's opinions is, it takes time. It takes time and it takes practice for sure. And then we have emotional boundaries. So this has to do with feelings. So healthy emotional boundaries include limitations on when to share and when not to share personal information. I 1000% believe in this. Not everyone needs to know your stories. Not everyone deserves that information. Not everyone needs to know every single detail of what you're going through. It's okay to have a sense of privacy. I'm huge on privacy myself. And then for number 4, for sexual boundaries, this has to do with consent. And I think, oftentimes, perhaps especially when we're younger, in high school or in college, it's very easy, especially for women, I would say, to kind of get backed into a corner, sometimes even literally, right? It's a cute guy. What do we do? Do we just go with the flow? Right. And so sometimes, even when we feel uncomfortable, it can be difficult to speak up. It can be difficult to get up and leave or to say something. And the same is true in relationships. The same is true in partnerships, relationships, marriages, etc. As human beings, we are autonomous. And so to not feel forced to do something that you don't want to, and to have a partner who respects those boundaries and says, no, you know what, I'm not really feeling it. No, I'm not comfortable with that. No, I don't want to try that. Right. That's really important, to have someone who respects those boundaries and to not be belittled or made to feel bad about that. Okay, so moving on to number 5, material boundaries. So this has to do with money and possessions, stuff, right? We love our stuff, we love our things. So healthy material boundaries involve setting limits on what you will share and with whom. So we can think about lending somebody something, right? Something that we really love. Let's say it's, your favorite sweater and your little sister wants to borrow it. Here's the thing, and this is my recommendation. I don't think it's a good idea to lend something that you really, really, really love. And why? Because there is a possibility that it will get, broken, lost, like stained, whatever it is, anything can happen. And so if it's something super special to you, I don't know. I think it's okay to have that boundary and say, you know what, in the sweater example, you know what, little sister, this is a sweater that's really important to me. It's the first cashmere sweater I've ever bought, something like that, right? And so, can you pick a different sweater? Can you pick a different pair of shoes or jacket that you'd like to borrow? That's fine, right? There's a way. I feel like there's a way to navigate those situations. And on the topic of lending things, money, my recommendation is the following: never lend an amount of money that you're not okay with never getting back. I'm going to say that again. Never lend an amount of money you're not okay with never getting back. So if you're comfortable with lending $1,000 and let that be, okay. If you're comfortable with lending $10, great. The point is, even when we're lending something, sometimes things happen. Sometimes people are not able to pay things back. So this is where those big family fights come in, the friendship arguments come in. Like, I lent, Michelle $300 and I didn't get it back, for example. Things like that. So it's good to have that in mind and really take that moment and pause and think about, like, can I lend this? Is it okay for me to lend this? Am I comfortable with the possible outcomes from lending this? Then you're good. In addition to material boundaries, well, I can't help but think of two different shows. If folks have seen the show Hoarders, right, you'll see people who have hoarded a bunch of things. It can be piles and piles of clothes, papers, dishes, whatever it may be. And when the therapists come in and work with them, oftentimes that attachment to those things, it's a sign of something else. Now, let me explain. If you listen to the story of people on Hoarders, their hoarding usually began as a result of something else. So, for example, people oftentimes have grown up in poverty. Okay. If someone's grown up in poverty, it is not unheard of that they will then try to hoard and keep things just in case. It's this ongoing joke in a lot of families, I think in Latinx culture, to save grocery bags. It's like, I need to keep 100 grocery bags in my cabinet just in case, right? This idea of just in case, it can be detrimental actually because of that hanging on to things that are not really serving the person or the family anymore. So going back to the hoarders example of the show, the hoarding will begin, after a death, for example, the loss of a parent, the loss of a child, the loss of a spouse, and the person kind of spirals out and begins hoarding. There's all kinds of reasons why people start hoarding, but I share this example to say that human beings, we do get very attached. We get very attached to our things, our possessions, right? Our stuff. And sometimes it's unhealthy. I'll just say that. Okay. So another example as far as materials, a couple years back, there was this huge push for minimalism. Everyone was really into minimalism, Marie Kondo, the art of tidying up, and that's all good. That's all wonderful stuff. And I do think it's fascinating because it is another way to think about possessions. Marie Kondo encourages people to ask themselves, does this bring me joy? Does this spark joy? And there was all kinds of memes that came out of that where people were basically getting rid of, everything but the kitchen sink in their houses. So take that with a grain of salt. All right. And so our sixth boundary that we'll talk about today has to do with time. I try to be very protective of my time because time is the one thing that we really can't purchase more of. I mean, we can get help, ordering things to have them delivered, getting the assistance of a TaskRabbit person to come and help clean, all those type of things, right? There are ways to regain a little bit of our time, but the sands of time are always flowing. Okay. So as far as time and how does that relate to boundaries, it really is about making sure that people respect your time. So I'll never forget, there was an event that I was invited to, and the host was 2 hours late. They were 2 hours late. And I stayed until I saw the host because I wanted the host to know that I was there, and I waited 2 full hours for them to show up. For me, that was a disrespect of time. That was a disrespect of their guests. And so I feel that this person understands that now. But we live and learn, we grow. But it's an example that really sticks out in my mind as far as like boundaries and time. I like to be punctual because, again, it's a respect of other people's time. And so, like I mentioned, I'm a professor. I'm actually a university professor at a university here in Los Angeles. And I continually reminding my students how important it is to be punctual. And if they have an appointment with me, that I appreciate them being on time. And also in terms of time, I make it very clear in my syllabus that I am not going to be really checking emails over the weekend because as much as I love teaching, and I love being a professor, I love teaching, I also have a life. I also have family and friends and activities and things that I need to work on myself in my time outside of teaching. And so they have definitely, they respect that. They respect that I set those boundaries and I make them clear from the beginning. That's important too, is that I set that standard up from the beginning so that it doesn't catch them by surprise. Okay, so we've talked about these different personal boundaries, 6 different types of boundaries. And I did want to touch upon how these connect to Latinx culture, because culturally, I do believe that Latinos navigate the world in a unique way, especially in this conversation of boundaries. So I wanted to get into this sense of cultural differences and generational differences. I am 1.5 generation. So on my mother's side, my mom was born in Los Angeles. My maternal grandparents are from Guatemala. My dad's side, my dad is from Ecuador. So I'm in this interesting generation of having grown up in Los Angeles, but having very strong roots to Central and South America. Okay, so it's very interesting. And in conversation with friends, this idea of boundaries has come up, and it's so fascinating to me that oftentimes in Latinx culture, speaking up or putting those boundaries, those healthy boundaries, can be seen as disrespectful. It can be seen as, oh, my daughter's talking back. My daughter's not grateful, right? My child is not grateful for all the sacrifices, etc. So it's interesting, even when they are healthy boundaries, even when it's nothing that is too big of an ask, it can definitely ruffle feathers. As we're talking about boundaries, it takes time. It takes time to begin to implement those boundaries. It takes time for people to begin to get used to new boundaries that may be implemented. This is a process. This is a growth process. So it doesn't happen overnight. I wanted to mention an article. This is an article by Loose Media. This article touches upon family dynamics. So this article is called Latino Family Dynamics, the Importance of Setting Boundaries. Perfect for our podcast session today. This article by Alejandra Aguirre talks about three main points. And so her first point is about communicating with parents. The second is learning to say no. This definitely takes practice. And then the third point that she makes is on machismo. And she talks about how Latinx families can often be rooted in machismo. All right, so let's dive in. So communicating with parents, it's easier said than done. I completely understand that sometimes it is difficult to have conversations with parents, and it can be a struggle. So, for example, sometimes the ideal would be to have a face-to-face conversation with someone, right? But that's not always possible for many different reasons. A person could be at a distance. It may just be honestly too toxic to have a face-to-face conversation and be there in person. Who knows? Everyone has their different situations and circumstances. But communication really is key. And I would take it a step beyond, learning to communicate with one's parents, learning to communicate with all the people in one's life, be it siblings, be it partners, be it coworkers. Communication is a skill. Communication is an important skill. Strengthening one's communication skills, having clear communication, and listening. My goodness, listening is a huge part of communication. And oftentimes people, they speak and they are just waiting to talk again. Quite literally, they're just waiting to talk again. They're not actually listening to what the other person has to say. So it's important to gain that skill of speaking, listening to what the other person has to say, and really kind of taking that in. So back to the article by Alejandra Aguirre, she mentions learning to say no. Now, this is definitely a huge milestone. When one can learn to say no and to understand that no thank you is a complete sentence, that is a tremendous accomplishment. It is not easy. A huge part of this is being okay with perhaps hurting someone else's feelings a little bit. For example, if you're invited to a barbecue and you have a lot of work to do, or you have other things you need to take care of, to be able to say, thanks so much for the invitation, I'm not able to make it this time. Sometimes we are guilt tripped. We feel guilt and we're like, oh, gosh, okay, like maybe I'll go, like maybe I'll just go for an hour, right? We feel guilt tripped into it when honestly we don't want to go, or we really don't have time to go. So learning to say no. In terms of a family dynamic, and again, I am learning this myself. I'm practicing these things. I'm with you in the same boat. But learning to say no when it comes to, for example, running an errand. Can you go get this for me? Are you going to be at the store? Can you please grab orange juice? Can you bring me this? It's like, no, I'm not able to. No, I wasn't planning to go to Trader Joe's today. No, I'm sorry. I can't do it today, but when I go to the store tomorrow, I'll bring it, right? For example, there are ways to communicate that. But again, it may ruffle feathers. It may create some hurt feelings. So finally, the third point from this article from Alejandra Aguirre is machismo. Now, this goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the generations, right? So in my experience, when a person's, let's say, grandparents, parents are from Latin America, and again, my assumption is my audience is Millennial Latinas. So when your family is from Latin America, that is a completely different culture and lifestyle and way of being than what we have here in the United States. It is a learning curve. It is different. And so this issue of machismo comes up where, again, the typical scenario of a family party where the women are always expected to cook, the daughters are always expected to serve everybody, to take care of the kids, right? This is all examples of machismo. And it can be very difficult to navigate and to try to bring, a different way of being into fruition. So, we know how machismo works. We know how the patriarchy works, to where women kind of get stuck in these cycles. And when a woman speaks up, she's seen as disrespectful. In Mexican culture, we even have, for example, La Malinche. She's the traitor, right? She's the traitor to her culture. She's the one who betrayed her people by being an interpreter and working with Cortez. So that's even present in Mexican and Mexican American culture, is that speaking up makes you a bad woman, for example. So there's a lot to navigate, definitely. So the takeaway that I hope folks will have from this conversation on boundaries, and I hope it's been helpful, is that what happens when we don't speak up, when we don't share what's bothering us, it ends up leading to resentment. It can end up leading to a lot of anger and frustration and resentment within oneself. And that's like poison. Having that kind of anger and resentment within one's body, it's literally a poison. And so it's so critical for one's mental health, for one's spiritual health, to speak up, to begin to speak up. And again, this is baby steps. It can be baby steps. It can be small incremental changes. Because if we don't speak up and we don't create boundaries, we ultimately betray ourselves. So there is a book that I would like to recommend to folks listening today. So it's called Set Boundaries, Find Peace, A Guide to Reclaiming Yourself. Now, this was a book by author Nedra Glover Tawwab, and it was published a couple of years back. It was published in March of 2021. It's a great resource. You can find it on Amazon or wherever you like to purchase your books. And it has so much great information about learning boundaries, implementing boundaries. So I hope this has been helpful to you to begin thinking about boundaries and thinking about the boundaries that you do have in place and how they have been a positive implementation in your life. So as we wrap up, as any good professor, I will encourage you to do a little homework, or better yet, let's call it spirit work, because ultimately we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and doing deep inner work, it's not easy. It's not easy. This is not for the weak. This is not for the faint of heart. But it is worth it. It truly is worth it to dig in, to dive in, to do the hard stuff. It is worth it. Because again, coming out the other side, you'll be so much stronger, and you'll be so proud of yourself for how far you've come. So as you reflect and you do your spirit work for next week, I encourage you to think about the following. What are the areas of life that would benefit from you strengthening your boundaries? This can be with family, this can be with friends, this can be in workplace. And then what can you learn from the areas of life where you have been able to establish good boundaries, you have healthy boundaries in place, and what does that feel like? How does it feel? How does it feel every time that you're true to yourself and you're able to implement those healthy boundaries? I really hope that this has been helpful for folks. I am excited to be on this journey with you on the Gold Hoop and God podcast. Let me know in the comments what type of topics you'd like me to cover next time. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please spread the love by subscribing. On next week's episode, which is entitled Pancakes or Salvation, I'll be talking about faith and navigating religion. Until next time, ciao. Thanks again for tuning in to the Gold Hoops and God podcast with Dr. Guerra. New episodes available each Wednesday on Spotify. Ciao for now.